Hello and welcome to the fourth IPQ debate on the consequences of the US election results for Europe and the transatlantic relationship. I'm Henning Hoff, Executive Editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. A Trump win was a distinct possibility. That was what the polls had been telling us for months. Still, Donald Trump's emphatic victory has come as a shock to Germany and much of Europe and presents a challenge to our continent, to put it mildly. Just take Germany. It is already suffering from a recession and a structural crisis of its economy, which Trump's trade policies will certainly aggravate, on top of which there is the question of the future of the US security guarantee. The Trump victory, which by all accounts is also a great day in Moscow, throws up questions about the future of Ukraine and dealing with Russia, about Europe's security order, about the future of the transatlantic relationship, about the ongoing war in the Middle East, about China policy, about climate change policy, and indeed the rule-based international order itself, the United States created after 1945, and Trump during his first term did his part to undermine. So to discuss all this, I have the pleasure of welcoming two treasured IPQ contributors. We have with us Liana Fix, Europe Fellow with the German Council on, with the Council on Foreign Relations, based in Washington, D.C. Together with Sophia Besch, Liana has written for us about a European plan for Trump, which now comes in very handy. Welcome, Liana, from Washington.
Thank you.
We also have with us Daniel Fiott, who is the head of the Defense and Strategy Program at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at Vrije Universiteit in Brussels and a non-resident fellow at the Instituto Elcano in Madrid. Daniel has written the lead article for our current issue called Rethinking European Defense on the introduction of a European Commissioner for Defense, which continues to be the most read article of the current issue. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Henning. Thank you.
We have about 45 minutes, and I want to jump right into it with myself putting a few questions to our panelists. After some discussion, we'll be opening up for your questions and comments. To join the debate, please raise your virtual hand, and I'll invite you to pose your question or comment in person to our panelists. You're also welcome to use the chat function, and I'll do my best to put your questions or observation to the panel. Please note that this event will be recorded or is being recorded and will be published subsequently. And so let's start with Liana. You have been commenting on the elections all through the night. What's the mood in Washington right now? And what is your first reaction?
Thanks so much, Henning, and hello, everyone. So the place where I get my coffee every morning, here just next to the White House where we sit, the adjective that was used most in overheard conversation was anxious, and I think that sums up the mood pretty well. Everyone is anxious here, not many white smiles around the White House and the NSC here. I think the result was a surprise to the extent how successful Donald Trump was. It is a sign that the Democratic campaign was not run well, or not as not as well as it could have been. I mean, from the beginning, obviously, one can say Biden stepped down too late. This didn't allow for a primary debate. Kamala Harris was not perhaps the strongest candidate who could emerge from that. And the message that Kamala Harris' campaign had from the beginning about joy was perhaps a message which resonated with suburban voters, but not with voters in poor regions of Pennsylvania who were really concerned about the costs of living. And I think that's the result that we have. Voters felt that their concerns about cost of living, about inflation, about immigration were not heard in the Democratic Party, and the policy positions that Kamala Harris proposed did certainly not alleviate the concerns. They were very broad, they were not particularly detailed, and I'm sure they can talk more about the economic side. So in the blame game, and it will certainly go around, there's certainly a fair share of blame to give to the way the Democratic Party has handled this election. At least it has contributed to this big victory of Donald Trump, which did not have to be the case perhaps otherwise. What's the mood sort of from DC looking around the world? I got many shocked messages obviously today morning from friends and colleagues in Europe, and my reaction was rather that Europeans, our friends and colleagues in Europe and around the world, should be careful not to slide into a kind of moral arrogance towards this election result. That's the feeling that I got. How can that happen? This is impossible. This is the same kind of sort of moral. How can so many people vote for someone like Donald Trump? This is the same kind of moral arrogance that perhaps was also a problem for the Democratic Party by portraying Kamala Harris as the good one and Trump the bad one. This alone is not sufficient. This is not how voters vote. This is not. It's not Darth Vader who has invaded the United States here. It's bad, but we have to stay analytical. We have to understand where this comes from. And in particular, Europe has to stay analytical, tactical, and not, engage in moral outrage that which Europeans love to do so much. And the reason for that is that Europeans very quickly will have to find a way to deal with this Trump administration in a smart, tactical way and to exert their influence, because it may seem that the United States is not a good place to be at the moment, but Europe, where Donald Trump might put into question a security guarantee and the support for Ukraine, is perhaps not necessarily a good place either. So there's a long to-do list for Europeans that they have postponed for too long on Ukraine, on their own security and defense, and we can go into that into more detail. But I would just urge us all to quickly move on from shock and dismay and condemnation and all the feelings that one may have after this result to rational analysis and tactical thinking about policy options for Germany and Europe, because there's a lot at stake.
Thank you very much, Liana. Daniel, sort of you reacted in a similar way, sort of taking to social media this morning, urging calm, or that is the way I read it. Can you elaborate? Sort of what is your first reaction and your recommendation for Europeans to react to this outcome?
Yeah, thank you so much, Henning. I actually quite agree with what Liana has just said about the moral outrage point. It's probably understandable that people will feel a bit emotional, but actually it doesn't help us at all. And we really do need to get to the solution stage of trying to put all of our potential measures in order and in quick order. And I think one of the big things we have to think about now is that perhaps we've wasted time for the last few years. Now, I don't want to get into a discussion of kind of who I told you so or they told you so or the blame game, because I think just like moral outrage, that doesn't help anything. But it is a fact of life that we as Europeans have squandered time on coming up with solutions to a potential Trump presidency. And here he is. So I think there is a sense, at least in Brussels this morning, pretty much across Europe as well, of a little bit of a shock factor. That's the first thing, that President Trump won in the first place. But now I think the cold water has been poured on us already, and that you already see politicians, institutions already trying to position themselves on certain possible responses. I must say, in that respect, I was following the immediate aftermath from European individual bilateral messages congratulating President Trump. And I think much like everybody on this call, already starting to see the kind of political cogs moving in Europe, especially with France and Germany already positioning themselves in a kind of leadership role. Again, maybe it's the shock factor in all of this, but I do think there is something rational about maybe just waiting a little bit and also making sure that when we do consider what a European response could be, that it is not only just a handful of states, but we're also thinking a bit more broadly as Europeans, right? The risk, of course, is that we play a rerun of the last election where everyone was rushing to kind of curry favor with the new administration. And that I don't think in the long run is very, very good for European unity. And the thing that we should really be counting on now is a sense of unity, because if you don't have unity or that kind of political solidarity or understanding, then all of the points that I think we will discuss about what we need to do in defense, trade, technology, etc., none of that will really work unless we have a political basis for that. So maybe there is some virtue in just being a bit calm for now, and trying to come up with some new ideas and strategies, and also waiting to see what the president is going to say. That's the other thing. We also need to pick up on some of the messages from him and his team.
That's definitely true. Just as a follow-up, Daniel, maybe you know more about this. There have been talks between high-level officials in the EU and capitals, somehow sort of thinking about Trump-proofing Europe, or or at least Ukraine. Do you have any information about sort of how far these talks have gone, or sort of in Berlin, I've often heard the counter argument saying, "Well, you can't prepare for such an outcome anyway, so we won't." This was a little bit the reaction from the chancellery. But maybe do you maybe two few sentences on that? Is there preparation work already underway?
Yeah, I think there has been a bit of preparation work actually, but we need to be a bit careful about what that really means in practice. I don't think we should get into the understanding or notion that we have a ready-made strategy or plan that can now be deployed and everybody will follow it and it will work perfectly. I think the purpose of the Commission, the European Commission's work itself internally, but also the work within the European Union more broadly with the capitals and the member states, is actually to scenario or to scenario test. So to come up with particular scenarios in different sectors, and then to see what policy options you have there. Of course, I say that because the EU also is not a federal entity, right? So there are some limitations on what the EU can do. But I can tell you that at least in areas where the European Commission and the European Union does have a lot of leverage, in particular in trade policy, these are one of the key areas that are keeping officials up at night. And probably many of the people in this event also saw the images online of the Parlement, the headquarters of the European Commission, in complete darkness, except for all of the lights on in the office last night. So either they were having a great party or a kind of therapy session together, or they were coming up with some of the scenarios that they thought would happen and that they now need to put in practice, or at least convince the member states that Europe needs to go in a specific track.
Thank you very much. And Liana, sort of what do you expect from a second Trump administration when it comes to European policy? I mean, we know about the very concrete plans when it comes to tariffs and trade policy, but in terms of sort of the broader political transatlantic relations and how the Trump administration will interact with the EU, which for Trump, at least this is one famous quote where he says it's all a racket to undermine America's economic position in the world. What sort of is your sense of what to expect if you are in Europe's shoes, sort of what will come our way?
So I think there's a problem of bandwidth. I think Europeans can become very quickly overwhelmed because the long list that you presented at the beginning, Henning, what kind of strategic problems Donald Trump poses to so many policy areas that we have, from trade to security to climate and so on, can just give you that feeling this is just too much. We kind of let's see what happens, and we kind of go with the storm. I don't think that's a wise approach. I think Europeans should very quickly write a priority list of what are the biggest and most urgent problems that they immediately need to work on. And number one on that priority is Ukraine, because that's the issue where Donald Trump has said that he will try to move on that immediately, ending the war in 24 hours and so on. And what can Europe do on Ukraine? First of all, it has to come up with an idea how it can narrow the gap that will come up if the US reduces its support for Ukraine. It cannot replace certain military deliveries that the United States will do, but it can try to narrow the gap, at least on financial means, and it needs a plan for that. If Donald Trump stops financial and military support for Ukraine. And secondly, Europeans need to prepare for this peace summit that Trump wants to have. And again, in terms of feeling good, it might be tempting to just try to stay out of that and then to say, well, it was Donald Trump who lost Ukraine, not we Europeans. But I don't think that's a smart approach for Europeans. Europeans should get their hands dirty and work with Trump on whatever idea he has for his peace summit with Ukraine and Russia, because there are bad, worse, and worst outcomes. The bad outcome is that Trump goes into a negotiation, forcing Ukraine and Putin to the table by saying, Putin, if you don't agree to a ceasefire, I will surge military support for Ukraine or offer Ukraine NATO membership. It's bad, but still not the worst option. The worst option would be Donald Trump goes into such negotiations and says, well, look, Russia, we offer you as an incentive sanctions relief, and we stop military and financial support for Ukraine. That would be the worst combination with which the Trump administration could go into such negotiations. And it's the task and the responsibility of Europeans to try to prevent this from happening and to try to go for the least bad option if these negotiations are going to take place, because Europeans will not be able to prevent those. So again, this is about tactical moves. And then on the priority list, I think tariffs will be very quickly very high on the priority list. But going from problem to problem, instead of being overwhelmed also by the noise that will just come from the US, from Trump, from his team, trying to pick out what is noise, what is signal, who are the people who are actually the ones we should be listened to, will be an important part.
Thank you very much. Yes, so my memory of the first 4 years of Trump was exactly this kind of constant noise coming out of Washington, and it was sort of quite stressful actually to deal with that. But that's probably just my whiny European soul, which is complaining. Daniel, also on Ukraine, do you agree with that being the number one priority? And sort of following on what Liana just said, do you think there's a way the Europeans could sort of force themselves also to be at the negotiation table?
Yeah, I think the biggest fear is this negotiating table point, because it doesn't seem clear to me at this stage that an incoming Trump administration automatically sees a seat for Europeans around the table. So coming to Liana's point about the Europeans actually needing to be around that table, I guess there are many ways of doing that, and not least because I guess President Zelensky will also reach out to European partners as a kind of somewhat of a buffer, I guess, in any kind of negotiations if they happen. And keep in mind that President Trump would have to bring both Russia and Ukraine to the table, unless, of course, he takes some of the steps that Liana rightfully points out, which is the kind of shock therapy, right? That I will immediately stop deliveries, and then we'll see where the dynamic leads from there. Europeans clearly at this stage do not agree with that premise, but not maybe, let's say, fully comparing the two conflicts. But we have been here in the past as well with Afghanistan, in the sense that we were just victims to a decision that was taken elsewhere. And then Europeans had to kind of pick up the pieces or adjust to it. And I think in the case of Ukraine, obviously for European security, it's of a much higher importance than anything that happened in Afghanistan. But I just fear that we might still be in the same political position where we have our interests, but then they're not in any way integrated within these steps. And I think, yes, I would agree then, therefore, with the point that Ukraine is the number one security issue for European security. Also because we have to keep in mind, and that's rather important, that it's not just about any peace deal or so-called peace deal that might be agreed. It's the sustainability of that. And President Trump knows very well that he will be out of office and will never return again after this term. So what is that? 4, 5 years, right? What does that leave then for the Russians after 4 years in any negotiation? Trump has left the scene. Does any peace deal that may have been struck up still hold as legitimate or not? Or will Russia continue to aggress his neighbors in the way he's done without Trump around? These are the types of questions we will also have to be thinking about. So not necessarily any fine print of a peace deal and whether or not that's acceptable or not, I'm not sure. But also the kind of sustainability of any peace deal that might be agreed. And I think it's on that sustainability issue that most Europeans will fundamentally disagree, because there's always the threat in the future of a Russia ramping up again, or further aggression.
Many thanks. And back to Liana, the biggest sort of complaint of the first Trump administration was sort of the underspending of the Europeans when it comes to the expenditure on defense and security. Do you think something like a big gesture on the part of the Europeans, like sort of setting up a big defense fund on the European level to finance European rearmament, or a sort of drastic measures in sort of national budgets to improve the situation would impress the Trump administration, or what is your feeling with regards to burden sharing and the role Europeans have been playing in NATO?
Yeah, as my wonderful colleague Sophia Besch uses to say, 2% is your grandmother's 2%. And it's actually true. We celebrated ourselves this year at the NATO summit in Washington for reaching 2%, 10 years, and not even all NATO members, 2/3 of the NATO members, 10 years after it was agreed upon. So there's just no way how Europeans can come to the Hague summit of NATO next year, if everything is still fine with NATO at that point, without a plan and without a promise to Donald Trump how they're going to increase their defense spending. This will be a topic, and Donald Trump has alluded to it, and it's actually a consensus in the Washington defense community, security defense community, that 2% will not be enough. It will need to be 2.5% or 3%, which gives Europeans the homework to think about how they can reach that without without fighting each other, without end. So we need to think about creative ways, which means perhaps not, again, a COVID-style joint debt measure, but perhaps exemptions, for example, at Germany's debt break, but also on the European level, of defense spending being counted into the debt limits and so on. We need creative ways how countries have the fiscal capability to increase defense spending without necessarily having to close all kindergartens in return, which obviously will not fly domestically and with populace there. So that's the homework that Europeans have to do. They will have to come to The Hague with an offer to Trump. But even if they come to The Hague with a promise to Trump to increase defense spending, it doesn't mean that NATO will be safe. So in parallel, Europeans still have to think about how they can not only increase defense spending, but fill the gaps, the most urgent gaps that they have for their own security and defense, and write up a plan how they can do this. And again, Daniel is much better situated to talk about this, but this will take a while. IIS has once done a great study on this. It will take 10 years to be able to fight in a middle-sized conflict. But starting now to identify what are the gaps in European security and defense, how can Europe fill these gaps, and how can we actually have a European pillar into NATO that remains standing in case the American pillar collapses. So 3 parallel approaches that I would recommend there.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Is that really still the stage we're at, sort of identifying the problem rather than addressing it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, in some respect, independent of, the coming Trump presidency, it's in Europeans' own self-interest to invest in their defense anyway, given the regional security environment, and even beyond that, when you consider the Indo-Pacific as well, and Asia more broadly. But of course, the Trump presidency will animate this, and I fully agree that we should immediately expect a discussion to be about where is the 3 or 4% of GDP. And again, I find myself in agreement with Liana here that this inflexibility that we have on rules under the Stability and Growth Pact in particular, there will need to be some kind of creativity here. Already in the case of Poland, you see that they're hitting the upper buffers of this level, and it's not sustainable. So something will have to give there. So individual member states, allies will have to increase their defense spending. And as the recent summits have made clear, NATO summits have made clear, the 2% is only the baseline. It's not the ceiling, right? So we're already baking that into our assumptions here. The hope is that it doesn't take us another decade or more than another decade to go up even more in our defense spending. The second element in all of this, and I think Liana also rightfully touched upon this, is the capability side. So just because you have the money, it doesn't necessarily mean that you then have the military capability to defend yourself. And that's the real discussion here. For me, I think with the Trump presidency, what we will start to see, and this will be very difficult for Europeans to deal with, is that he will not just insist on more money, but that money going to American capabilities and weapon systems, right? Now, that in itself can be seen as a kind of the contours of a bargain, which, by the way, was already in play in the first Trump presidency, where individual member states were signing up to defense contracts as a way of placating Donald Trump and his administration. I think that will come back again today. Some might argue on a kind of more rational basis that actually, well, it probably does make sense to just go ahead and buy US products because it means we can get them in the battlefield as soon as possible. But there is a problem there, which is that, first of all, European politicians have understood that you can't be investing in defense capabilities if it doesn't give you some economic return. So again, coming back to the own domestic situation and domestic argument, where does that defense spending go? Beyond defense, but also the economy is really, really important. One final point, and I think that this is going to be one of the huge structural pressures facing the US actually in the coming years, is that it's all very well for us to say, well, we can simply procure equipment from the US and it will be delivered in time. No, that's not how it works. We can sign contracts, but there's absolutely no guarantee that we will receive the platforms that we need and the defense capabilities that we need in time. And there are already many good studies coming out of US agencies, the Congressional Research Service, for example, already saying that the defense industrial base in the US is really under a lot of pressure to produce what it needs for its own defense and its customers. So we really have no choice here in Europe that I think we need to not only invest in capabilities, but it's the structure of our industry, manufacturing potential that also needs to be improved. And that comes full circle as one final point, I think, to what Liana rightfully said about how possible it is for Europeans to fill any gap in case the US cut off the supply to Ukraine. As Europeans, I think we've been very poor in producing ammunition levels that would see to the Ukrainians' needs in all of this. And that's a very basic level of production in defense, right? So even going into capabilities that are more sophisticated than this is going to be a real challenge. We should have done this 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but we don't have that luxury of hindsight now. So we really do need to develop our industry as well as capability gaps.
Thank you very much. And since we are past the 25-minute line, I would welcome you now to raise your hand and sort of have your questions ready for our two panelists. And while we're waiting, I have one final question to Liana, referring to your article. You suggested then back in August that it would be wise for the Europeans to build a kind of contact group or a different kind of grouping, which would act as a sort of interlocutor with a future Trump administration. Why is that, and why isn't the EU good enough?
Because the EU of 27 is too big. I think the EU needs to have a quick, transactional, innovative discussion of what Europeans can do. I think in some ways we need to go back with a smaller group of EU countries to the kind of infamous sitting in the back rooms. No one needs to smoke cigars, but that was and in the time of Helmut Schmidt or in Guadeloupe, pretty popular at that time. And this kind of behind the scenes, behind closed doors, creative thinking needs to be done. And we propose a group of which we call the E7, Germany, France, UK, Poland, and Italy, together with European Commission and a European NATO representative, which is a little bit tricky because the European NATO representative obviously will be a little bit of a bind to formulate positions towards the US. But again, this would be a confidential framework to quickly come together, to quickly develop proposals that can be discussed with other member states, not in the bureaucratic committees and proposals of the European Union, but more in a freewheeling contact group context. And the idea behind that is also that Trump will link different policy fields. So he will blackmail us to follow his Ukraine policy, otherwise he will impose tariffs. So he will blackmail us to impose sanctions on China for the support for Russia, otherwise he will reduce military support for Ukraine. Or so he will link all the policy areas that are important to us in a way which we are institutionally not capable to react to if we just stay in the silos and in the committees that we have, because tariffs have to be discussed at the European Commission. Ukraine support has to be discussed at member states and in the European Council. European security has to be discussed in NATO. So we need a contact group that brings sort of these silos together and is able to quickly develop and advance ideas. We were also inspired by this one famous NATO summit with Donald Trump, where very quickly European NATO leaders huddled together and tried to change the agenda to prevent the worst outcome. This is the kind of informal, quick policy making that we need. It's not about replacing the EU or any other. It's not about a big committee, but really about people getting together in a nice room and brainstorming and offering solutions that hopefully will then be acceptable to other EU members in this E7 constellation.
Thank you very much. So 2 hands are up. First, Eileen, please, my colleague at the German Council for Relations, but maybe you can introduce yourself nonetheless.
Of course I can. Thank you, Henning. Eileen Matley, I'm a senior research fellow in the DGAP Security and Defense Center. Thank you very much, Liana and Daniel, for your initial remarks. You already mentioned that much will hinge upon who will actually be serving in the second Trump administration. Do you have any sense of who might be prevailing and who might be heard when it comes to Ukraine in particular? Because obviously someone like Vance, who's been very outspoken on cutting aid to Ukraine for a very long time now, is in stark opposition to someone like Mike Pompeo, who might become foreign secretary, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, who seems to be more hawkish and who might be willing to lift limits, for example, on which weapons Ukraine might be able to use. That's my first question. And then secondly, obviously, we're very much interested in what will happen to Europe, how Trump will treat Europe and engage with European allies. But what about Indo-Pacific allies? Because the question I'm asking is, well, first, if I'm also working on sort of the interconnectedness of both theaters at the moment, but also, and I think that is something that Trump has in common when it comes to Europe and the Indo-Pacific, he seems to be very ambiguous. On the one hand, he's praising, dictators, authoritarian leaders, and at the same time, also as of recent months, he's also alluded to maybe coming to the aid of Taiwan, which might be in line with the ambiguity policy that the US pursues anyhow. But still, I mean, if you have some answers, if you have a sense of where US policy under a second Trump administration towards that region might be heading, I'd be very grateful to hear from you on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I heard that Richard Grenell is a shoe-in for the State Department, but maybe that's if I'm wrong, then all the better. There's also another question by Hans-Joachim Schmidt. If you could put your question also to the panel, please.
Hans-Joachim Schmidt, former civil servant of the Foreign Office. It concerns Ukraine as well. This morning we had a discussion in the DGAP about the role of Europe could play in striking a deal with Russia about what is a ceasefire and so on, security guarantees. What would you be your recommendation how to approach the new administration to be included in working out such a deal? Because for Central European states, it's nightmarish to know that they may strike a deal over the heads of such a state like Ukraine, particularly of what happened in the past with some Central European states. And Ukraine is afraid of that, of course. How to make sure that Europe gets involved?
Thank you very much. And there's one question I throw in from the chat. I paraphrase. It's basically about European leadership. Is Scholz or is President Macron still in a sort of position to organize this kind of unity, coherent European response that you've been advocating? Who wants to go first? Liana?
I can start. We're looking forward to what Daniel says about this. So who will be responsible for Ukraine? I'm not sure about the prospect of Pompeo. I think his proposals on Ukraine and NATO are too centrist for Trump. I'm not sure that he actually feels so close to J.D. Vance that he would follow J.D. Vance's proposal, because he has kept J.D. Vance at a distance throughout the election campaign. And in his first term, and I always recommend the book by Susan Glasser and Peter Baker about Donald Trump, who was the best analysis of how he actually did run the White House and did do policy. The most remarkable aspect was that he always had advisors who had very different opinions and kind of let it be like an arena with gladiators, you know, fighting against each other. And the one who survives is sort of the one whose policy position or recommendation then he finally adopts. So I think it's difficult to say now who that's going to be. There is a middle path between Vance and Pompeo, and that's a proposal by retired General Kellogg, and who brought in increased weapon deliveries in return for Russian willingness to come to the table, but also included sanctions relief, which might be a problem. So there are numerous proposals going round, and we should also not forget that he might change his negotiation position on the day, the hour, and the minute that he sits down at the table, because he suddenly thinks that his own gut instincts are better than what he might have agreed on with advisors. Plus, he has a personal relationship with Vladimir Putin. And this personal relationship is an axis of influence for Russia. Their meeting in Helsinki has been a one-on-one meeting without any advisors, which was very concerning, and which gives reason to believe that he might be influenced by Russian talking points there. On the Indo-Pacific, Daniel is much better positioned to talk about it. I think it's a big problem because the Biden expedition has really worked on the alliances and to bring those closer together. And obviously, everyone feels without a roof now. But again, I leave this to Daniel. How to get to the negotiation table on Ukraine? I think these kinds of normative arguments about negotiations cannot take place over the head of Ukrainians, over the head of Europeans, are not going to fly in any way with Donald Trump. He doesn't care. I think Europeans will have to buy their way into negotiations and to pay their way into negotiations. So saying, look, we will increase our financial support for Ukraine. So one proposal which has been floating around was that the United States only takes over the military support and the Europeans do all the financial support, which could be something that could be brought back into the discussion by Europeans, and Europeans saying, okay, United States, as long as you continue the military support, we are taking all of the financial part, which would be huge. But in return, because we pay so much in, we want a seat at the table. And I think that's a logic that Trump understands, because it's almost like a shareholder logic, right? I mean, we have shares into this, we pay into this, so we bought ourselves the right to be included. I think that's at least the way how Europeans should be thinking, if not exactly how it's going to play out, I think.
Thank you very much. Daniel.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of questions. Maybe let me jump into the second one from Mr. Schmidt from the Foreign Office. I think we also have to be a little bit careful about how we define what a peace deal actually looks like, because if Trump is talking about ending wars, and he said it again today in his speeches, he wants to end wars. That is quite a broad spectrum. That doesn't necessarily mean even partition in practice. It may just mean at a very basic level a ceasefire for certain months. We just don't know what will be thrown into the deal, and we don't know how he's defining peace at this particular time. So I think it's also incumbent upon Europeans to do a bit more research or intelligence gathering on what that could mean in practice. And depending on where it sits on the spectrum, this definition of peace or a peace deal, that might also animate the Ukrainian side. But again, I think it's very unclear what is meant by a peace deal. He's also, by the way, using exactly the same language in the Middle East at the moment. But beyond maybe serving domestic audiences, I'm not sure in practice if they have a fully fledged, worked out plan for what that really means yet. On the point about how the US are perceiving not only Ukraine but the Indo-Pacific, I think there are some similarities there in the teams or in the individuals, at least that I know, that are at least vying for positions right now in the administration. And I think one of the ideas that has certainly gained a lot of ground in these circles is this whole discussion about the two-front or two-war scenario, which the US wants to effectively avoid, right? So that's a war in Ukraine and a war in Taiwan at the same time. Now, there are a few factors which unite the strategy from the US or these views that come from the US, which is, again, coming back to the defense spending argument, right? So whenever you see discussions about the solidity of US defense pledges in the Indo-Pacific or alliances, they're always focused on the fact that maybe Taiwan or Japan do not spend as much money as they should do on their defense, right? And that's a recurring argument that keeps coming back, that they have to spend more on their defense as well. But actually, in this whole discussion of prioritization from a US perspective, if they have to choose between the one or the two in the two-front scenario, it's clearly going to be the Indo-Pacific, right? And that's where you would expect, on top of the arguments of countries like Japan having to spend more, you would expect the kind of solidity of alliances to be a bit more assured than they are in Europe, simply because, and I've heard this direct from the mouths of some individuals, it's up to Europe to deal with its own problems in its backyard. It's not that we have a position, we actually don't really care. So you better just come up with your own plan and deal with it, because for us, the prevailing challenge in history now is China, and everything is seen through the China lens. I think, by the way, that this also causes a lot of difficulties for Europeans, because I think now our political class have accepted the idea of a certain interconnectivity between Asia and European security. And of course, we probably didn't need North Korean troops to be marching into Ukraine or Russia to help us understand that, but there is an interconnectivity here. And I think the point that Liana made in her response about the interconnectivity or bargaining between different policy issues is really going to be the core challenge here across both of these regions. And I would presume, and I kind of read that already in some European policies leading up to the elections, that Trump is going to try and extract bargains on the China discussion. And he knows very well that Europeans have a different position when it comes to China. We don't really have a fully fledged or as hawkish position maybe as he does, but I think they want to drag us in that direction, certainly in global politics. Now, what that will mean in terms of bargaining between our trade policies or not is unclear at this stage. It would be very interesting to hear from the Trump team how they perceived the recent tariffs that were placed on electrical vehicles, for example. But I'm also thinking beyond that as well, even in the European context, how increasingly defense, trade, and technology policy will be intertwined in this bargaining phase. And especially on trade and technology, that's where I worry the most, right? So it's very clear that American operators are not fully understanding or even fully appreciate European regulation on technology firms, especially US technology firms, right? So what might happen in a context, especially where someone like Elon Musk gets a government position or something like this, who's been very vocal on not liking EU regulation, will that also become part of the bargain of we will not impose tariffs on European goods if you lower regulations for US firms in a particular technology sector? These are the types of really ugly discussions, I think, that we will be having.
I may add very quickly, Henning, I know we're about time, two points. Just to underline the point about impatience in DC with European security and defense, if you try to convey to some of the Trumpian camp, as Daniel before said, that Europeans will need time and they don't have the capabilities and the resources now and the financial means, they don't care anymore. They're like, well, the Ukraine war didn't wake you up. So what else should we? And this is not only coming from Trumpian voices. If not the Ukraine war woke you up, what else did we don't care how you do it? You are rich, you are supposed to do it, and we will not spend 1 second thinking about how you do it. We just will leave and you'll have to deal with the mess, whatever you want. And we don't care if that creates a new rivalry in Europe or whatever the European arguments are. Get it done and get it sorted out. And that extends to the question also, what I've heard from sort of the Trumpian camp, is not only about a trade-off between Ukraine and Taiwan. The trade-off is also from that perspective, what if we have a simultaneous attack on Taiwan and an attack on Estonia? And the answer is, what would you pick, Estonia or Taiwan? And the answer is Taiwan. That's what I've heard with these people. And last very quick point on China, the lack of European response to China propping up and reconstituting the Russian military to the extent that it's again a threat to NATO, completely overlooked by Europeans, ridiculous response so far, will be a problem if one advisor connects these two issues with Donald Trump and tells him, well, look, Europeans want you to invest into Ukraine and European security. But at the same time, China is neutralizing everything that you would pump into Ukraine and European security through its support for Russia. And Europeans are not doing anything about it because they want to keep good relationships with China. From Trump's perspective, this will very logically sound like, why the hell should I invest in Ukraine and European security if this is countered by China's support for Russia and Europeans are not willing to stand up to China there? If someone makes this connection to him, Europe will be in big trouble, because then its sincerity about supporting Ukraine and European security will really be put into question.
Thank you very much. And since we are run out of time, just a very quick last question to you both. So being inspired by Jerome Legrand's questions there, I think that the big question, isn't it, that sort of, will Europe stay together? Will there be European unity in response to the Trump administration, the second one, or will there be disunity and individual states trying to deal with the administration on a bilateral level, sort of, so united or divided? Maybe that's my last point. And a question to you both. Daniel, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think, look, in reality, we will have a response that is designed by the European Union and its institutions, for sure. And we will also have bilateral maneuvers by individual member states. That's what happened the last time. I expect it to happen again this time. The problem, I think, however, is that what happens if we start to get in a position where the EU's response, the agreed EU response to any Trump policy, is seen as a bargaining chip by member states themselves. That is to say, What if they put the EU position first, and then as part of a bargain with Trump on any policy area, say, yeah, but we can backtrack from the EU position. So you go for unification as a bargaining stance to then become divided over time on different policy areas. That, I think, is going to put a lot of pressure on the bureaucracy at the moment. And here, I think there is a really important point that Henning, you asked in your question, and I purposefully avoided it first, but now I will come back to it, which is that the two largest member states in France and in Germany have weak governments. And normally how it works is that when you have weak governments, when you have these governments that are strong, it also empowers institutions and personalities at the EU level to also be strong and to follow through on policy. But we've never really been in a position where both Germany and France have been weakened domestically. And then the pressure is put on EU institutions to somehow make up that political shortfall or to make up that political weakness. So there's going to be an extreme amount of pressure, I think, on the European institutions, and they need to be a bit careful that they don't become the object or part of the bargaining between member states on a bilateral basis and the US government. And you kind of see that already, by the way, with probably the line of Hungary at the moment, where it's a kind of antagonism between the bilateral stance and the unity, the imperative of unity.
Thank you very much. And Liana, last word to you.
I mean, that was excellent from Daniel. So just from my experience as coming from Russia policy originally, there was a long history of bilateral multilateralism in the European Union towards Russia, which means you leave it to the European Commission to be critical, and on a bilateral level, you're pursuing your own relationships. And that can certainly be a mechanism, a trained mechanism that Europeans can try with Donald Trump, leave the criticism and the fights to the European Commission and to Ursula von der Leyen, who Donald Trump hates anyway. And on a bilateral level, European member states are trying to pursue their own good relationships.
And with that, I thank you all for joining us this afternoon, this morning in the United States. Please join me in thanking our two panelists, Liana Fix and Daniel Fiott. And I know it's a momentous day. We are still sort of in the process of trying to understand what it all means. I hope this sort of contributed a little bit to these questions. And yes, I hope to see you soon again at the German Council on Foreign Relations to read our magazines. And with that, a very good afternoon, a very good morning. Goodbye.